Welcome back. We are giving the introduction to section 11.3, and this is going to be just a brief video, and you'll notice that I've actually opened up the book from page 793, and I felt this was just a lot more neatly organized than I could put it together with simply using my hand. So what I wanted to do is talk you through exactly what's going on in relation to the discriminant, at least doing an introductory lesson discussing the idea. So when we look at the solutions for quadratic equations, we describe these solutions in different ways. And the types of solutions we get will depend largely on the value of the number under the radical. That's why when we look at what's called the discriminant is the part of the quadratic formula that appears under the radical b squared minus 4ac. You'll notice that in terms of the quadratic formula, when we identify the discriminant as b squared minus 4ac, we do not include the radical as being part of what we describe as the discriminant here. Okay? So there are three basic types of answers that you can get for the value of the discriminant. You can get a discriminant that's equal to 0. Now, we didn't see that in the last section, but we can certainly take a look at those types of problems and see how the solutions of those relate in terms of how we get these, in terms of the answers we get. So here it says when the discriminant is equal to 0, we get the same solution twice. So we describe this as repeated solution and a solution that is rational. So here we have when it's equal to 0. Now, if the value of the discriminant is not equal to 0, it can only be two other things. It can be greater than 0, or it can be less than 0. So the first case we talk about is when the value of the discriminant is equal to 0. When it's equal to 0, we're going to get the same solution twice for the quadratic, meaning essentially it has one solution, but it shows up two times. We'll take a better look at that when we get into the lesson. I'm going to jump down to the bottom a little bit and talk about when the value of b squared minus 4ac is a negative value. So if we get a negative number under the radical, as you already probably know, that a negative number under a radical yields an imaginary number. How this impacts the solution to the quadratic equation is that an imaginary number under the radical is going to provide two answers that are both complex, that is a plus bi form, and not only complex, but they are complex conjugates of each other. So the first things we talked about is when b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, then we get the same answer twice. When b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, when it's negative, then we're going to get two answers that this will yield an imaginary number under the radical, or imaginary number, and will give us complex conjugates. Now, if b squared minus 4ac is a positive number, that is, if it's greater than 0, then we look at two possible outcomes here. The first one, is it a perfect square? If it is, then we usually get some nice numbers, either whole numbers or some fractions. No radical will appear, though, if this is a perfect square. If we get a number under the radical that's not a perfect square, then we're going to have some answer that has some remnant of a radical. It's the radical part that's going to make these irrational. So, if the number under the radical is a perfect square, the radical will disappear. And because there's no radical, it makes the number rational. Here, if we have a number under the radical that is not a perfect square, that means there's going to be a radical remaining behind, and that the solutions are going to be irrational conjugates of each other. So usually we don't use the word conjugates to describe these, and usually they don't use them here either, but we're going to take a look and explain this in further detail to see what is meant by that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take some basic quadratic equations. We're going to obtain their solutions for them using the quadratic formula. And then after we obtain the solutions with the quadratic formula, we'll take a look at the solutions and take a look at the discriminant to see how these relate. Okay, so we'll come back with that in our next video to take a better look.